This course covers everything you need to start contributing meaningfully to existing open source projects. You'll learn from James Pierce, the former head of open source at Meta. You'll learn the benefits of contributing to open source, how to demystify a code base, best practices for submitting code changes, and more.
Welcome everybody to Become an Open Source Master. This course from Taro will hopefully help you become an open source master. I'm James Pierce and I'm happy to be with you on this journey. Before we go any further, I should just say, not sure the title is entirely accurate. I can't guarantee you're going to become a complete master at open source. It's a philosophy, a way of working with software that might take a whole lifetime to really truly master. So what we're going to do in this course is introduce you to some of the basics, some of the concepts, so you can begin that journey of mastery and hopefully get a very fulfilling and rewarding experience from doing so, perhaps even professionally. Right, let's dive in. So firstly, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm James. I'm a former engineering director at Meta. For much of the time I was there, of course, it was called Facebook. I worked on the data infrastructure teams where I was responsible for things like some of the analytics tools, dashboarding tools, and so forth. I worked on a bunch of developer infrastructure teams, helping build IDEs for use inside the company, build tools, and so forth. I worked on Portal, which was a consumer hardware product that you may have heard of. It was a smart speaker device with a whole bunch of Facebook features in it and a cool kind of tracking camera for family calls. And of course, I worked on the open source program, which is why I'm here today. And a lot of experience of running an open source program at scale. That was probably from about 2013 to 2017 that I worked on that program. So hopefully I'll be able to share some of what I learned along the way with you today. So just a word or two about the open source program at Meta, or Facebook as it then was. It's probably one of the largest open source programs in the world in terms of companies open sourcing their own projects. It's always been a very important part of the Facebook engineering culture to both use and create open source software. Right from the very early days of the Facebook.com website, it was using PHP, MySQL, Apache, and so forth. And so I think there was always that community of standing on, philosophy of standing on the shoulders of giants and helping to give back a lot to the same communities that had made it possible to create the company in the first place. In terms of some of the projects that the company was responsible for, I'm sure you've heard of React and React Native, which are front-end JavaScript frameworks for web and for mobile devices. Jest is a front-end testing framework. The list of front-end projects goes on and on. Data infrastructure like Cassandra, Presto, and more recently Velox, which is an exciting new entrant in that space. A whole bunch of developer tools that the company builds for itself at open sources. Buck is a build tool. Hack is the programming language that is used on the server side at the company that runs on HHVM, which is the runtime, basically the web server that is used for all of the Meta properties these days. So those are all open source. And Open Compute is a little bit different, but it's another huge open source related program at the company. That's one that actually open sources the designs for servers, networking, hardware, even whole data centers, that helps to share what the company has learned with the rest of the industry and drives down the cost of manufacturing and installing such things. But although some of these are a few years old now, there's still a lot going on. And if any of you are following the machine learning or the AI space, I'm sure you're aware of projects like PyTorch, which is a very, very popular machine learning and AI framework that was originally developed at Facebook. And Llama, of course, most recently, the large language model that is really competitive with a lot of the non-open source frontier models. SAM2 is another recent open sourced AI and machine learning project for object separation in images. And again, the list goes on. So still very much a part of the company's culture. If you are interested in more about the Meta or the Facebook open source program and how the team thinks about the philosophy behind doing it, I would recommend going and checking out a talk that actually I gave at an open source conference called OzCon, and that is up on YouTube. We'll put the link in the description. And there we talk about why the company does open source, what are the benefits to the company of doing so, and hopefully you'll get a sense of some of the rationale. That said, most of this course is not going to be about what it's like to run an open source program. We're really going to be talking about what it's like for you as an individual to get involved. But that's an interesting sidebar if you're interested in a bit of context. So as for me, I no longer work at Facebook or Meta. That's why I can call myself a former director, I guess. But took the opportunity to do something a little bit different, and am currently living on a boat, as you might be able to see in the background, and sailing around the world, basically, very slowly. I'm actually presenting this course to you from Cartagena in Colombia, of all places. Yeah, one of the things that I've been able to do with my newfound extra time, as well as sailing, is really diving into doing more open source myself. So, I guess part of what makes me tick is always wanting to build things. Ever since I was a kid, I've always been a builder, always wanted to tinker with technology. And this last couple of years, as my GitHub profile there shows, has been a very productive one for me. I have been getting involved in a lot of open source communities, working on other people's projects, and more than anything else, working on my own major project, which is called Tinybase. So don't really want to turn this into a Tinybase advert, but certainly go check it out if you are interested. Tinybase is a reactive local first data store for web apps, although it also works on mobile devices as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the objectives for this course. We have got probably 4 or 5 things that we really want to cover here. The first one is really helping people to understand the benefits of open source in general. So you've probably heard a lot of people talking about open source, but you don't really know what it means. You don't really know why it might be good for you. So we'll touch on some of those concepts. Want to really help sort of set the right mindset for it as well. It's not something that you can just tackle overnight. Getting in tune with the way the open source ecosystem works is kind of a process in its own right. So we'll talk about what it's like to work on someone else's open source project. So getting involved and, most importantly, understanding how that code base works. Because if you're going to contribute meaningfully to it, you need to think about how to get inside it and how to understand it. And then mastering that code to the extent that you can actually make a meaningful contribution that the community or the maintainers of that project will accept. So those are kind of the high order, the pieces that we're trying to do here. But I guess we'll also try to couch it in the concept, or in the concept of how it's going to help your career. So if you're a prime career, you're trying to think about, like, how do you get a foot in the door? How do you get yourself known? Open source is actually a very powerful way to get yourself out there, get yourself seen, build up your own experience, of course, but make sure that your people know who you are, what you stand for, and they even have the opportunity to see some of the work you've done, which all helps burnish your reputation and your professional kind of profile. So we'll touch on some of that as well. There are some non-objectives for this course, having said that. So we're not explicitly going to talk about how to create your own projects. That's probably a whole course in its own right, and it's kind of tricky. And although the stakes are high, the rewards are high too, but it not necessarily kind of an easy first way to get involved in open source. So that's one thing we won't be covering. And we're also not going to talk about what it's like to work on an open source project when you are inside a company. So once you've been hired and, let's say you're working at Facebook and you're working on React from inside the company, we're not going to touch on that either. Although I think both of these are interesting topics. So, maybe if you agree with me, hit up the Taro forums and, say so, and we can think about doing these for some subsequent courses. Okay, let's kick off with a quick introduction to open source in general. So I guess the first question is, what is open source? And it's kind of an impossible question to answer, partly because there are just so many aspects to it, and there are just so many adjacent areas. I found this diagram on the internet to try to explain what open source is, and yeah, it's like a Swiss Army knife full of many other aspects. Open source software is obviously the core thing that we think of and that we'll be talking about mostly during this course, but you'll hear people talking about open data, you'll hear people talking about open education, or open standards, or open hardware, or open access, all of which are related and pretty exciting, and I'm sure that over time we could even think about doing some courses on some of these. But it's one of those things that's kind of comes to mean a lot of everything to everybody. So maybe we can actually look at a specific definition, and this is straight from Wikipedia, and I quote, "Open source software is computer software that is released under a license which the copyright holder grants users the right to use, study, change, and distribute to anyone for any purpose." So I guess that's the gist of what we're going to be talking about, and what we really mean when we're talking about open source. It's software that's been written and shared into the open, not just so that it can be read, but also that it can potentially be changed, that it can be used in other places, and even copied and forked and turned into something completely different. Now, there's a whole kind of discussion and set of debates. Well, some of them have been settled, but lots of conversations around what truly constitutes one type of open source versus another. And in the middle of this, there's a whole set of questions around what licenses these different projects are licensed under. Certain licenses will let you do anything you want with the software you see. Some of them will let you use it only in certain ways. Some of them will let you use it on the condition that you then go and open source the results yourself. Some require you to change your usage if it's in a commercial environment, etc., etc. So, I don't really want to wade into the pros and cons of all that nuance, but suffice to say, for the purposes of this course, we're going to be talking about open source software that's available nice and freely on GitHub. Most of the projects I'm going to mention are under the MIT license, which is very permissive, lets you use, take, copy the software as you wish. But just, as a heads up, sometimes you might wade into these conversations about what true open source is and what the different licenses are. And of course, that's just something to be aware of, to make sure that you're using it responsibly and that you are adhering to any licenses that projects happen to use. There's another section from the Wikipedia page about open source, which I think really kind of drives home what we're talking about today. So open source code can be used for studying and allows capable end users, that's you, to adapt software to their personal needs in a similar way that user script or custom style sheets allow people to look at websites and edit them. So it's perhaps a little bit of a dated quote, but one of the great things about the web, certainly in the early days, was that if you wanted to know how someone had built a website, you would just view the source of the web page. You could then take it, copy it, and adapt it. And I guess open source has a similar philosophy. You want to know how Facebook.com works? Well, one of the ways you can find out is go and look at how React works, and that gives you a sense of how Facebook's JavaScript developers have been building complex user interfaces. The other thing, of course, here is that if you do make interesting changes, you can fork the project to use it yourself with those changes, and of course you can submit those changes back to the original project so that everybody benefits. We're going to be talking about that a fair amount in this course. That's called, at least in the GitHub world, that's called making a pull request. Before we go any further, I'm just going to lead on with a little bit of a glossary, some of the terms that we're going to be using today. If you're already familiar with GitHub and the user interface and the language that is used to describe different things, feel free to skip this section. But we will be predominantly talking about GitHub. It is not the only place where open source exists. There are other source control services. There are other ways in which open source is distributed, and sometimes even over email forums and various other kind of unusual media, but for the purposes of the mass market and for kind of going with the flow, we're going to talk a lot about GitHub in this course, which you can find at github.com, and you can sign up for free if you don't already have an account, and that'll give you access to all of the open repositories there and start to look at the open source software that is in there. GitHub, by the way, also provides OAuth services for a lot of developer tools. So if you've got a GitHub account, it's also pretty useful if you're signing up for other things. You can use the same identity. So we're going to be talking a lot about projects, and we're going to be talking about repos, which is short for repositories. This is kind of the the heart of the unit of what an open source project is all about. I guess theoretically a project can be a superset of a repo. You might have a large project like React or Vite or Vue, which has lots of component parts within it, each of which is its own repo. But you might find that I'm using these terms interchangeably. Most repos belong to an individual or to a company, and you can tell by looking at the URL or the title up the top there which it is. And when you go to one of those repositories, you'll see pretty clearly, as you can see in this screenshot, the source code. It's sitting right there. You can see the folders, you can see the files in the main part of the screen. You can browse around that file system, see the software in the web browser. Of course, you can also download that code. That's the big green button. Variety of ways. Either you check it out to a local machine with a Git client. And by the way, we're not going to be talking about Git and source control per se in this talk. We kind of assume you're familiar with many of those concepts. But there are also lots of useful help guides on GitHub if you're not. Down the right-hand side, there's a whole bunch of metadata about projects, what their license is, which, as I mentioned previously, is quite important, the number of people that are following the project or starring the project, the number of times that people have forked it, and kind of gives you a sense of what the vibe of the community is, how active it is, the number of issues or bugs, the number of outstanding pull requests that people are making to the project. And across the top, you've also got links to things like discussions, sometimes wiki pages, and a variety of other material that's useful for helping you to understand the project. So there's a lot on this screen. This is kind of one of the main screens that you'll see and we'll be jumping off from. The issues screen, we'll talk about issues occasionally in this course. That's literally used to describe this GitHub concept of an issue which can be filed by anybody against a repo. It's often a bug that someone's found, but it can also be used for feature requests. Someone wants a project to do something that it doesn't already do, so you file a feature request as a quote issue, and you can tag them saying what parts of the system it's relevant to. It's helpful for the maintainers if you can also say how critical you think it is or some reproduction information, so it's easier for them to diagnose a bug. But that's what issues are. And very similarly, there's another screen next to that for quote pull requests, and these are actually contributions to the code that people are volunteering. Now, those all need to be reviewed, right? You can't just write a piece of code of your own and immediately it appears in React or Linux or whatever, right? So you basically need to propose your change through a pull request, and they're a little bit like issues. You have to say, what it's for, why it exists, what the impact is, and then you obviously attach the commits, the changes to the code that you think are going to be relevant for, for solving that problem that you've addressed. Now, one of the things we'll do later in the course is talk about how to build a good pull request to try to maximize your chances of having it accepted. There's obviously a comments system, so you'll be able to see people commenting on different pull requests and debating what's good or bad about them. And that's kind of an important way to understand how the community thinks about things. So now we get to talk about why we should work on open source at all. And this gets to the heart of the rationale for this whole course. What is in it for you as an individual to get involved, and what are the benefits that you're likely to see, both professionally and non-professionally? Well, goes without saying, I think there are many benefits to open source, but it's not just for individuals, right? There are benefits to organizations as well who create projects. I mentioned earlier that I did a talk at a conference where I talked about all the benefits that came to Facebook for helping with recruiting or for helping with engineering brand. So as a company, even as a profit-driven company, the benefits of giving away our software were huge. And of course, there are many benefits to individuals as well who create projects. It really sort of helps cement their reputations. But there are also benefits to organizations and individuals who use open source software. Especially these days where there's a lot of concern around security, cybersecurity, software that you don't know the inner workings of. You might think it's more secure because it's inside a black box, but actually that's a little bit less secure, because if there is a vulnerability and it gets found, nobody except perhaps the attacker knows about it. Whereas with open source, all the source code is out in the open, which means that if there is a vulnerability, then perhaps a hacker can discover it. But it also means you've got the scrutiny of potentially thousands of other good actors who are trying to find those vulnerabilities and solve them, which is why one of the main reasons people cite Linux as being a very stable server operating system. It's because you've got thousands of people that are able to scrutinize every line of code and ensure that it's stable and secure and not vulnerable in the way that perhaps more proprietary operating systems could be. So that's just on the usage side, let alone on the contributing side and participating in the community, which of course is a lot of what we're going to be talking about here. So what are the benefits that you'll get from joining an open source project, or even just joining the community on the peripheral, like getting involved, helping to understand how they work, and really getting to be part of this movement, part of this whole ecosystem. I think there are huge benefits to that as well. So let's go through some of these one by one. So some of the benefits of getting involved as an individual, as I'm assuming you are. The main one for me is that you're getting to work on code that really matters. You're getting to use code that you're downloading, and you're contributing to code that other people are going to be using. So it's all very well doing fun little hobby projects for yourself, but like, how awesome is it to know that you've contributed something that is getting used by other people? Even if it's just a handful of people, you get that rewarding sense of having created something that's bringing value elsewhere in the world. And I know this, right? I started Tinybase, as I mentioned, and when it was very young and very small, and just a couple of people were using it, it still gave me a great sense of achievement. It was still fun to know that other people were using my work, and I was helping to make their lives better. And then you get the excitement of seeing it grow too, right? And then you get to see the code being used in more and more places, and that sense of pride only increases. Another huge benefit, whichever part of your career you're in, is that it really helps you to improve your coding abilities for a couple of reasons. One, you're building code that other people are, or you're writing code that other people are viewing and scrutinizing and potentially criticizing or critiquing. They're going to be giving you feedback that helps you to improve. They're going to be pushing you to refactor things to make them as elegant as possible. They're going to be pushing to make sure you formatted the things as well as possible, that you're naming your variables and your classes as well as possible so people understand what's going on. But you're also getting to see code that other people have written, and that's a huge inspiration. I always used to say that one of the benefits of open sourcing Facebook software was that people outside the company could see the caliber of the engineers that were working inside the company simply through looking at the code that they wrote. So it can be very inspiring to look at software that you've seen some superstar building in an open source environment. You get to see new code bases that you've never seen before. You get to experience new patterns that you've never seen before. You get to see new techniques that you haven't seen before. And you also get to build relationships with the people that are doing all of this stuff. If you've come out of a university, for example, you've probably heard one or two people talking about, how to build software, and that'll be your professor or your teaching assistant. But in the open source world, there are literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that are building this software that you can learn from, that you can be inspired from, and most importantly, that you can build relationships with, whether they are the maintainers of the software or the colleagues on the projects that you're working with, or of course with the users themselves, who now you're suddenly going to have to start paying attention to because you're building something and they're using it. So that's a whole set of new skills that perhaps you won't have experienced earlier on or elsewhere in your career. That said, professionally, open source can be a real boon as well. It adds a whole bunch to your portfolio. It adds a whole bunch to your experience. You know, if you've been a little maybe light on actually working at professional companies, you can make up for that to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree, by having a nice rich portfolio of projects, large projects that you've worked on in the open source environment. And you know, you can point to that work. It's something that a potential employer can see, and it helps really burnish your reputation. Your reputation is as good as your contributions ultimately, and so, you know, this can really, if you're good at it, you know, you can really grow your personal reputation through being a responsible member of the community, through writing good software, through being friendly and gracious. People will begin to recognize your name. They'll begin to recognize the work you do, and that creates a ripple effect. It creates a network that can be very, very valuable, because the contacts and the relationships that you're making, you know, those are people that may in turn know about other opportunities that exist professionally. You know, perhaps you're working on a large open source project that's run by a company. You know, you might even find that when you interact with the people on that project, they are people who know about job opportunities at that company. And when you join that company, now you're going to be able to ramp up even quicker because you're already familiar with the software that you've been using in the open source environment. This is actually, by the way, just a little aside here, one of the other benefits of companies running open source programs. If you've got someone who's worked with React outside of Meta or outside of Facebook, when they join the company, they can be productive much, much more quickly, and they can become, you know, much better engineers and make a difference to the company and be effective. Whereas if they were unfamiliar with React, or if, let's say, Facebook had some internal system that nobody knew about, they'd have to spend 6 weeks or perhaps even 6 months getting up to speed on their proprietary system. So this thing is very symbiotic, I guess. That all said, I think it's very important to approach open source for the right reasons. Okay, this is not some mad scramble to just get a job, and people will quickly sniff out if that is what you're trying to do. Oh, I'm just going to make some quick contribution to React and that's going to help me get a job at Facebook. It's not. It's a much longer process. There's a lot more building involved. There's no shortcut to success. You do have to invest in this, and it will take time. And if all you're doing is trying to get a job in the next 3 weeks, then I don't think this is the right approach. It's definitely not an easy ticket into the technology industry. It's one that requires work. You actually have to put in the work, right? You literally have to put in coding work and reviewing work and community work, which is, you know, quite a time drain. But I would say on the flip side of that, it's real, right? People really know this is what you did. I guess one of the challenges with getting a job just based off word of mouth or just based on your resume is it's kind of just like whatever you happen to write down. And, you know, sometimes people don't always, you know, trust what they read in a resume because they don't know whether you're inflating your previous experience. One of the good things about open source is that it is authentic. Yeah, it takes a long time to do, but what you see is what you get. If you've seen people making really good contributions, then that's legitimate. That really is what they do. But I do want to emphasize once again, you know, this is a long-term commitment. It's not going to happen overnight. So do be patient, and you'll find some very high highs, but you'll probably also find some low lows where you've put in a whole bunch of work for a really amazing pull request and the maintainers don't understand why, and you need to kind of explain what you're doing. So there's a lot of patience involved, and it will take a long time. But on the other hand, this could be a lifelong commitment to open source. This could be a lifelong passion that you develop. And so actually that's fine, right? You're going to get to do this for the rest of your life. And like me, even after you've left the professional work life, you might still enjoy working on open source. So I think it's worth that investment. Most importantly for me, like, open source is a demonstration to other people that you really love building stuff. And you could have taken the shortcuts, but nope, you wanted to build something, you wanted to hack away at something, you wanted to try to, quote, make the world a better place, and that's all pretty awesome, and that's a fantastic calling card. And so if nothing else, that is the thing that hopefully this will bring to you, and the message this will send to other people, and even potentially your future employers. All right, let's think a little bit more about doing this for the right reasons. So some of the primary benefits of working on open source, we talked a little bit about this, the impact you can have on other people. The education and the skills that you're going to gain through looking at other people's source code, by having your own source code studied and commented on. You're going to get a lot of benefits from joining a community. You're going to be able to interact with other people, learn from them, obviously, but socially it might just even be fun hanging out with other people like you. And again, it shows that you have a real passion for building. So that's the kind of the summary of some of the right reasons for doing open source. But look, it might seem daunting. It's all very well me talking about these benefits, but some of the biggest or most popular open repositories, open source projects, can be huge, right? Vast swathes of code, like massive file systems. You've got to figure out what's going on in there. Hundreds of thousands of millions of lines of code. And yeah, that's not very easy to get started with if you're new to software development or if you're new to working in open source. You're going to come across projects with hundreds of bugs that have been issued, changes that people are making, kind of chaos going on all around you. And you won't always find a lot of documentation. If one of the corners is going to get cut, it's probably going to be documentation. So open source projects often leave a little bit to be desired in terms of understanding what the heck is going on and what the current state of things is, and what the project's even trying to do, and what the constraints are and what the requirements are might not always be clear to you or any of the many hundreds of other people that are working on the project. So, maybe I'm making it sound a little bit chaotic sometimes, and it is, but, it's going to take time for you to work your way around that. And the other thing I would say is that chaos and learning how to deal with it is actually itself a very valuable professional lesson. Because if this sounds familiar, it'll be because you've joined a large company and all of a sudden, again, you need to navigate a huge new code base. Again, you need to get familiar with what the current work is, what the bugs are, what the issues are. Again, you'll come across outdated documentation, if any. And again, you'll suddenly have to understand, customers and their requirements and the constraints. And get up to speed with new colleagues and teams that you're going to be working with. So, I think it's kind of a unappreciated benefit of working in open source is that if you can get your head around a big, complicated open source project, it's the same set of skills that you're going to need to get your head around working in a new professional environment. So these are all fantastic skills that you can learn to harness and which will serve you very, very well in a professional environment. Well above and beyond the actual code that you're writing or the reputation that you've built, just these kind of core team working, environmental skills that you're going to need in your professional life. Get to try them out beforehand. All right, so let's assume you're excited about open source. You want to jump in, you want to make a difference. First thing you need to do is find a project to get involved with. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about finding a repo, finding a project. So I think it's important not to, right out of the gate, go looking for the biggest, most exciting repo you can find to put on your resume. It's no easy path, jumping into React, or I don't know, Linux would be probably the most extreme example. You're not going to rock up one day, start making changes to the Linux kernel, get a nice bullet point on your resume and walk away. That's going to be an extremely long and painful process. So don't just go around looking for the big famous ones. By the way, there are already hundreds of people working on those. So if you want to make a name for yourself, maybe you want to find somewhere that's a little bit less busy, where you can have a little bit more impact. And I think the best way to find something you want to work on is to think about this organically. It's not a scientific process. Look for something that you think you'll have passion for. Nothing worse than being stuck on a project that you're not that interested in or that uses a technology you don't really like. You're not going to be able to enjoy investing the time to make that happen. So think, I guess, fairly selfishly a bit about this. Think about the things that you're going to have a passion for, so that as it takes off and as your contributions get greater and greater, you're feeling good about it. Easiest way to find something to contribute to is maybe something that you already use. And lots of benefits to this, and quite easy to do too, right? It's something maybe that you use at work, if you're in an existing professional environment which is using an open source project. you're already familiar with it. You know where it is. You know what it's supposed to do. You probably already know some of the problems with it. Or maybe it's something that you're using as a side project that you've been building in your spare time. Again, it's something that you know through it being a dependency of yours, and that you want to help make better. A couple of quick tips for finding out what some of those things might be, by the way, is that in the GitHub screen, main screen for a repository, across the top, you'll see a tab called Insights. And I would recommend, even if you're just curious, if you've got a project that you are working on personally or at work, go to that Insights tab and look at the dependency graph. The dependency graph attempts to show all of the projects that are both using this project and that this project is using. So dependents and dependencies. And sometimes you might be a bit surprised by how many projects are dependencies of the one you're working on, because this is transitive, right? So there are many dependencies that one project uses, which in turn have many dependencies, which in turn have many, many dependencies. But this view is kind of a handy way to go in and see, oh, look, this thing that I work on, this thing that I'm building is dependent upon X, Y, or Z, or X prime, Y prime, Z prime in turn. And, maybe skim your eyes down that list, look to see if anything takes your fancy, look to see if any of these are good candidates for you to work on. Because then you've got the added benefit of knowing that you are going to benefit. Added benefit that you'll benefit from this now making the project that you're using become more successful in its own right. And it gives you a huge head start when you do this, because you know exactly what this project is for. You know exactly what its intent is. You might already be familiar with calling the APIs that it exposes as a consumer. And that makes it a lot easier for you to really get your head around, the fundamental philosophy of what that project is all about. And of course, it's not perfect, probably, right? There are things that you wish it would do that it doesn't do, or things that it maybe does do but you wish it didn't do, or maybe things that it's supposed to do that it tries to do that it doesn't succeed in doing. And those are all places where you can go in and address those issues. So adding features, fixing bugs, and so forth. And that end user empathy, if you like, helps you become certainly much more passionate about working it. But in turn, it'll help you to write better code that's now using this project. You're not having to hack around its issues. You've actually gone and fixed it in the right place where it should have been fixed in the first place right from the start. So definitely think this is a good tactic. And I often do this myself sometimes inadvertently. I'll be working on Tinybase, and maybe something that Tinybase depends upon has an issue, and I'm like, am I wrong here, or is there something wrong with the project? You assume, I don't know, maybe it's me, but I assume that everything I'm using is perfect, and then of course I discover it isn't. Like, am I wrong, or is it wrong? And then I go and dig around, and I find that other project has already got an issue filed against this particular behavior that I'm puzzled by. And I'm like, okay, well, perhaps I can go and fix it. Instead of in Tinybase writing some weird if-then-else statement to try to get around this bug, I can actually go to the right place and fix it and leave a little pull request. And, it works both ways, because I've now helped that customer, that developer fix my dependency. But they're now more familiar with me, and they're more familiar with the fact that Tinybase is depending on their system. And so maybe in the future, if they're making changes, they might even consult with me to say, well, what we're doing going to be helpful for you or for Tinybase. So you start to build that relationship. Super valuable. So as well as looking at maybe smaller projects that you use as an individual, or smaller projects that are being built by other individuals, it's also worth looking at some of the larger corporate projects. Like I said, don't dive straight into something huge and scary like React or Visual Studio Code or something. But there are still very many small or medium-sized projects that are being built by companies. And that's also a great candidate, right? Just because it says Facebook at the beginning of the repo name doesn't mean you should be scared away by it. You might find that it was something that was open sourced a long time ago. Maybe it doesn't get quite so much attention as it used to. And in fact, you stepping in and helping out is going to be still incredibly valuable. And it comes with higher stakes in the sense that you're now going to be interacting with professional developers in that company. But if you get it right and if you do a great job, that might bring incredible rewards to you because you're now building a relationship with those individuals themselves. And I actually wanted to call out an example of when that happened. Okay, this is quite a while back, but this was from the very, very early days of the React project. So an engineer called Sophie Alpert was working at Khan Academy when React was first launched. And she was looking at different front-end frameworks, which back in the day was probably things like Ember and Knockout and I don't know, whatever other things. But React was kind of the new one on the scene, so she did an analysis of these different front-end frameworks for Khan Academy and decided to adopt React for portions of it. Wrote a blog post about it, got involved with the React community, helping to evangelize React, I guess, through things like this blog post, but also then started making changes. And also started spotting performance improvements. She obviously wanted Khan Academy to run as fast as possible. And so when she found performance issues in React, she fixed them for her own benefit or for Khan Academy's benefit. But, what do you imagine happened back at Facebook? Well, those same performance improvements then helped make Facebook better. And Sophie quickly got a reputation inside Facebook for being this rock star engineer that was absolutely crushing the React performance issues, and that became a very healthy relationship that she had with the React team, even though she didn't work at Facebook. Well, surprise, surprise, when Facebook then needed to actually hire more engineers for the React team, like who are they going to go and talk to? It's people that they already know are familiar with this space. And not long after this, maybe a year or two, Sophie was one of the main candidates for those roles, and came in and had a very, very successful career, firstly working on the React project, and then actually even becoming the manager for the React team, and taking it on to, much bigger and better successes 3-4 years after this original blog post that she'd written. So anyway, that's some inspiration perhaps of where getting involved with a corporate project, even a very young, small one, has gone on to really help boost someone's career professionally. So you might be asking yourself, well, what are the sorts of companies that are active on GitHub? Where am I going to find these open source projects that large tech companies are offering? And actually, it goes without saying that GitHub is as good a place as any. There is actually a section on the GitHub website called the Octoverse report, where annually GitHub does an analysis of the big companies and their projects. So, which are the accounts, the corporate accounts that have the most projects or the most stars or the most contributors or what have you. Octoverse.github.com. And so yeah, you can look at this year, but also look at previous years and get a sense for how companies are investing in open source, which companies are really putting their weight behind certain projects. There's even a section in there, I think, in the most recent one, which talks about which company projects are the most welcoming of first-time contributors. So that's kind of interesting if you're thinking about joining one of these things. Where are you likely to find a very friendly welcome to help make contributions? And there's plenty of other places you can go and get these ranking lists. This is just one from a website called gitstarranking.com. And this is the kind of list you'll see. Microsoft, very, very active open source company these days. Google, very, very open, a very, very active open source company these days. Apache obviously is not a company, that's an open source foundation. Facebook at number 4 and number 6 in the ranking list, so it's a shame they don't get to combine their stars. They might do better on the rankings if they did. But there's a section of projects which are more oriented towards research and one which is more oriented towards production software, so I guess that's why they split that. Alibaba is another large one. Tencent, OpenAI, of course, TensorFlow, which is a Google project, and the list goes on and on. So, plenty of large tech companies that have very, very active open source ecosystems. Spend days going through these if you want, right? Check out all the different projects they've got, what's hot, what's not, maybe some of the projects that used to be big that have maybe fallen by the wayside and you'd like to get involved with to help resuscitate them. There are some notable omissions on here. There are some large tech companies that maybe you might expect to see more of. I guess Apple would be one of those, perhaps Netflix. But what you'll often find is that those companies are contributing into these projects, even though they're not being run by their own account. There is a corporate Apple GitHub account, and there are some pretty interesting projects in there. But you'll also find that they're obviously contributing to things like the underlying browser for Safari, for example, which is open source KDE. And anyway, go check it out. Lots of fun to be had exploring around there. And I guess one final place to go and look for crazy, unusual projects to work on, if you're feeling lucky, just go to the GitHub trending pages. This is a view of repos that are growing quickly, or that are suddenly getting a lot of contributions, or that are suddenly getting a lot of stars. And sometimes it's a little bit of a random list, slightly short-term view of the world, but you know, these are, I guess, these are the lists where every new project kind of cuts its teeth. Hacker News, of course, is another great place to go looking for new things that are being launched. Perhaps even Product Hunt if you wanted to. Looking for projects that are perhaps pushing the boundaries a little bit, slightly more innovative, that seem to have captured some kind of zeitgeist or are doing something a little bit more interesting. And yeah, if you want to try to get the first seat on a rocket ship, then you never know. Something on here might become the next React, or the next large language model, or the next IDE or something. Who knows? So always keep your eyes open for interesting things happening. Might be something that takes your fancy and you're like, that's it, I love that idea. Didn't quite have what it took to start it myself, but I can see someone else has started that, and I'd love to jump in and either start using it or start building with it or into it myself. And that's another great way to get started. I think a final word on helping to establish where you want to contribute in your open source journey is to just make sure you don't limit yourself. You're going to learn different things with every project that you contribute to. You will learn a whole bunch working on a large project like React, but it's only kind of one view of the world, it's only one slice of technologies, it's only one programming language, it's only one methodology. You could then go and work on some back-end infrastructure and you'll find something completely different, language-wise, design-wise, community vibe-wise, right? And so every project you work on will add something to your overall experience and add something to your overall portfolio. And the more familiar you are with a given project, the more productive you're going to be in that one place. But if you're trying to build an overall view of the bigger technology world, the more places you can work on, or the more projects you can work on, the more places you can commit to spending time, I would say the better. Right? Everything is going to start adding up to some grand thesis in your head of how technology works. And certainly speaking as someone who's worked in the technology industry for some time, you spend early parts of your career diving into one thing and you get it completely nailed, and then you go to a new thing and you're like, oh, wait, this is crazy, I don't understand it at all, it's nothing like what I saw the first time. But then when you go and look at the third thing, you're like, I can see bits of number one and I can see bits of number two. And you go to number four and you're like, okay, yeah, this is kind of an amalgam of 1, 2, and 3. And then you work on project number 5, you're like, all right, I got it. Like, I understand pretty much how, the same principles that come up over and over again work. And it kind of builds, like I say, a bigger sort of unified thinking around technology, to the extent that, now I guess I could get dropped into some random new project and I've still got a learning curve, but I'd be like, okay, I can see some things that I recognize from this part of my background, or this part of my background, or this project that I worked on, or that project that I worked on. And you've kind of got all this filed away. So, look, I appreciate you're probably going to be doing this in your spare time, or you're going to be probably doing this at the same time as trying to look for a job. So time is definitely very valuable. But the more things you expose yourself to, better, both professionally and non-professionally. So, all right, so you've got a list of places that you're thinking about contributing. You've got a bunch of projects you think would be really cool to work on. How are you going to narrow it down to just a few to start off with that you can contribute to? And we touched on this a little bit earlier when you're looking at working on a dependency, one of the main things is just work to solve a need. Join a repo where there's a concrete improvement that you can make. It's a project that you are going to benefit from. You're going to feel like it's useful for yourself. You're going to have a passion to work on it. There are lots of ways that this can happen. Like we said earlier, you found a bug. It really annoys you. You got to fix it because it makes your own project better. You found an API that you just think is insufficient or could be more elegant. It's something that you think could be improved. Or maybe there's a new API that you want to add and you wish it existed but it doesn't, or you want to be able to add an extra filter on some REST API and you think it's probably much easier for you to add it on the source rather than you trying to parse through it on the client. Use your self-interest, your self-motivation to jump in and work on these things. I think it's way more powerful to do that than just try to work on some abstract set of problems that you don't kind of understand. So that's the kind of the main motivation for jumping in and picking a project, one that solves a need. Second thing I would recommend you do is assess the health of the project that you're thinking about contributing to. And there are some good heuristics for this. On the surface, every project might look great, right? Lots of code, lots of people, lots of users, but dig a little bit deeper and see whether you can find out whether this is somewhere that you would enjoy working. Is it a place where pull requests are getting merged in? You don't want to write a whole bunch of code and then discover it's just sitting there because the maintainer has given up and walked off and left the project unmaintained. Do you know anyone else that has worked on this project? Can you talk to them? Can you communicate with them, find out if they've got some experiences that they would like to share, both positive or negative, that help you understand if it's a healthy ecosystem. Is this repo owned by a big company? On the whole, that means it's going to be well maintained. Unfortunately, not always, right? There's still going to be projects that get abandoned by large companies and then archived or forgotten about. So the point I'm trying to get to is here, think about how you're going to read between the lines, not just the high order GitHub statistics, but how you're actually going to look at the health of the project by drilling into some of the detail. So one thing you can look at, which I think is pretty important, is how are the issues on the project. So it's the second tab after the code, and obviously the absolute number tells you something, right? If there are 0 issues, it either means the project is perfect, which is very unlikely, or it means that there are no users and no one's found anything wrong with it because no one's found anything. They're not using it at all. So it's healthy to have some issues, but at the same time, you don't want to see a project that's got 5,000 issues, none of which have been attended to or read or solved. So you're looking at things like the ratio between the issues, the number of issues that have been solved versus those that are still outstanding. You are looking at whether they are being tagged and triaged, like these ones. You can see they've got tags describing whether they're to do with, I don't know, documentation or which part of the system they relate to. The fact that these issues here in React have all been tagged gives me a good sense that, at least there's an individual or a team that is responsible for going through these issues and either closing them out or assigning them to the right places. That's a super good sign. Look for issues that have got lots of emoji reactions, generally positive ones. You can look not just at the recently added ones, but on the right hand side you can see here, you can sort them by most commented, least commented, or usefully the least recently updated. So this now shows you the oldest ones. Like, why have these really old issues just been sitting there? Is it because nobody wants to fix them, or they have been fixed but no one's accepting the change? Is it because the maintainer has just gone on holiday? Whatever reason, just get a sense of how these things are aging. And when we were at Facebook, we really tried to work on these numbers, right? We really tried to make sure everything was being triaged, everything was being analyzed, because there's nothing worse, no worse signal sent to the community than thousands of issues that are all just being ignored. And so you can learn a huge amount about a project just from looking at these screens. The other thing to think about is what are the conversations that are happening on this project already? A lot of these will happen around the issues, but they'll also happen around the pull requests. And this is often where a lot of the interesting conversations will happen. You'll see people discussing code quality, code design, You'll see people trying to really, work their way through issues. Pretty interesting to see those conversations and get a sense of who the players are in terms of the, maybe the core maintenance team, who are the people with the strongest and the best opinions. So, get a sense of, what those interactions are like with the community. Because if you are going to get involved and you're going to be contributing to this, where are you going to, where are you going to get your feedback from? What is that feedback going to be like? Are they going to be welcoming? Are they going to be supportive? Are they going to help coach you through these contributions that you might want to know before you make that first contribution? There are some repos that are notoriously unwelcoming, and I'm not going to name any names, but, that's a trial by fire, which, might be enjoyable to some people, but, may not be the thing for you. So partly what you're doing is just trying to get a sense of whether they're going to welcome you and your contributions once you start making them. There are also, by the way, as well as pull requests, there'll be many repos that have a discussions tab. This is React. This doesn't have a discussions tab, but many do. And that's another place where you'll see people debating future changes. And again, gives you a good vibe. Some other very sort of objective, I would say, statistics about how a project is doing. There's a tab at the end there called Insights, where you can see how much is happening in a given week. So you can see how many pull requests are open and being dealt with, how many are being closed, how many issues are active. You can see individuals that are actually making those merges or making those commits at the bottom there. So maybe click through on a few of those avatars, get a sense of who the key individuals are in the project. This is a pretty useful dashboard. There's more below the fold here. You can scroll down and see the kind of work that people are doing. Again, giving you a good sense of if this is the project you want to work on. And given that you probably want to work on something that's got some, momentum, take a look at the commits. This is React, as you can see. It's pretty active. Quietened down a little bit, maybe a year or so ago, but it's picked back up with a new release. And you can see, it's many tens of commits potentially daily. So there's a good sense of momentum, good sense of community, good sense of activity, and that's something to be welcomed by, I think, because now you know that it's a project that's being used, staying alive. In contrast, this is another project. Again, I'm not going to name it, but this is a project that has a very, very different profile. And so you can see in its first year or so, it was very active, very busy, lots of work happening to it. But then it kind of tailed off, and now maybe there's kind of a long tail of a noise, a few dependencies being fixed every couple of days or what have you. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't work on a project like this. In fact, maybe you should, because it doesn't look like it's got a very active maintainer, and maybe over time you could step into those shoes and build your reputation that way. But it's clearly a very different type of environment to the previous one, React, which is very active. This is looking like it's starting to slow down. It's at a different part in its overall project lifecycle. And then this is another project which I probably would stay away from altogether. Again, not naming names, but it was pretty active for a while, had a couple of pauses, and now it just seems to be completely flatlined. No one is maintaining this. No one is changing any pull requests. No dependencies, addressing security issues. This is completely dead, and unless you're feeling pretty brave, this is not one that I would get involved with straight off, because I think it would be very frustrating. You don't know who's working on it. You obviously don't have commit rights, so it would take you a very long time even to get your code looked at, let alone landed. So yeah, this graph can tell you a lot about the state of a project and how welcoming they're likely to be to your contributions. And then finally, we touched on this in an earlier section, there's a great graph at the end of the GitHub pages where you can see the dependency graph of a project. You can see what uses it, you can see what it uses, but certainly projects that are being used by many, many other projects are more likely to be kept alive longer because they play that kind of pivotal role in the ecosystem. And this is React, and surprise, surprise, there are 23,000 projects 23 million projects that use it. Yeah, I thought 23,000 was a bit low. But yeah, hundreds of thousands of packages, tens of millions of other projects, and this list goes on and on. I'm not suggesting you go through this list and look at those projects in turn. Some of them might be quite small, but you now know that React is kind of a key project, and it's not going anywhere. and that would be a good one to work on. But even if it was a small project, even if it was a moderately sized project, go look at this dependency graph, see how much adoption it's getting, and get a sense that, yeah, it's there to stay, at least for the medium term. Okay, and if that all checks out, if all the statistics look good, if the community vibe looks good, it's a project where you think you can make a difference, you have empathy for the problems they're trying to solve, go for it. Time to jump in. So, we've decided we want to get involved with open source. We've found a project that we think looks pretty interesting. Next up is the question of how to actually participate, how to get involved. There are lots of different ways that you can help with an open source project. Obviously, you might suddenly think that the main contributions you're going to make are code oriented, but hopefully we'll see there are some other alternatives as well. And even if you are going to contribute code, what's the best way to do that? Basically, I think you have two options. Either you set out to create something that's new and that's unplanned in the existing repo, or you can try to pick up some work that's already been identified, maybe something that's already on a project roadmap, or something that's already got an issue filed against it. In both cases, it's important, I think, to reach out to the community owner or the maintainer of the project to let them know what you're planning to do. I guess it's possible that you could just put up a huge pull request and say, hey, here you go, and it'll get landed. But I think it's always a little bit more polite. There's a better protocol around making contact with the community first to let them know that you're going to be helping out. This process, in a way, is making sure you can go with the flow. So you're unknown at this point. You've attempted to identify a repo. You've jumped in, started to get familiar with what's going on there. But the people who maintain the repo or the other community members, they don't know you yet. They don't know who you are. They don't know what you stand for. They don't know how good you are. And so it's important to recognize from their point of view, you're basically a stranger, and you need to really work to earn the trust of the people who are already working on a project. So it's pretty difficult generally to just put up a whole bunch of new code and get a change accepted that way, because they don't really know what you stand for and where this is coming from. Make sure that you, especially if you've got an idea for something that hasn't already been identified as an issue, open up a discussion. If it's a project that's got a discussions board, then start by asking a question. Start by identifying what you think might be valuable. Make sure you're very open to feedback. Ask questions about what might be the best way to approach a problem, rather than coming up with the solution ready-baked and then expecting someone to understand the context. Really try to build the context around what it is you want to do, who you are, why this is valuable, and ideally that's easiest to do if there's already an issue and you can jump up in the comments on the issue and say, I'd love to get involved, maybe I'll tackle this. Is everybody okay if I take a look at this? This is how I'm planning to solve it. And as we mentioned in one of the very earlier sessions, these are exactly the same techniques you're going to need if you're working on software in a larger tech company anyway. Imagine the Facebook.com codebase. You can't just turn up and start landing new features straight away. You need to interact with a team that's already responsible for that part of the product. You already need to understand what their roadmap is. You already need to understand what the issues are they're trying to solve. And so again, you're getting the experience of socializing your ideas, socializing what it is you're planning to do before you go away and do it. And it might seem like you're having to do more work up front before you actually write the software, but it does mean that when you do write the software, you're much more likely to get it landed, much more likely to get it adopted than if you just kind of dumped thousands of lines of code in front of people and expected them to understand where you were coming from. I want to walk you through the example of what I think is an excellent community interaction. This is on my own repository, Tinybase. Until this point, a lot of the work on Tinybase, the majority of the work on Tinybase was just me. I was building the software. I knew the work that needed to be done. I kind of in my head had a roadmap of where it was going and where the gaps were. But this is an example of a community interaction from my point of view, through the eyes of the maintainer of the project. So basically, woke up one morning and there was a new issue that had been put in Tinybase, not authored by me, authored by a guy called Benedict. And he starts off very politely talking about some of the benefits that he sees in Tinybase and how it can be very flexible for interacting with other data sources. And he says, given that it's so flexible, I'd like to propose a new one. I'd like to propose a connector to PowerSync, which is a type of SQLite-oriented database that he wanted to connect Tinybase to. So he's already said in this opening paragraph or opening sentence, this is why I think Tinybase is great. This is something I'd like to propose. He says he's done a proof of concept. He's got it working well. And so he knows it can be done. He has identified that there's a blocker that needs to be solved ahead of time because I was making some assumptions about the SQL dialect that PowerSync didn't support. So he's already identified like one of the things he's going to have to solve ahead of time. And basically, he's given me, as the maintainer, a massive amount of confidence that he knows what he's talking about. Firstly, he's kind of seen what the architectural approach needs to be. Secondly, he's identified where some of the issues are likely to be along the way. Thirdly, he's been really polite and very generous and benevolent with his write-up here. And I'm like, yeah, fine, go ahead. I'm so used to seeing issues coming up which is just like, oh, X doesn't work or Y doesn't work. But no, here's one where someone's clearly thought through what they want to achieve. They've laid out their roadmap in a way. And yeah, I'm immediately feeling very confident that this person, who, by the way, I've never met, I don't know anything about Benedict, but I already have a great sense of confidence in his future work. So I assigned it, or I think he self-assigned it. He tagged it as an enhancement, identified that he was going to work on it, and great, I'm feeling good. Next thing I see, a couple of days later, is a pull request, which is him attempting to solve that first blocker that he had identified, which was the fact that my SQLite implementations weren't using the on replace feature or replace feature in the same way that he needed. So here's an issue that he wants to get out of the way before he can land the main feature. And so this is a very benign pull request. We'll talk about this later, but there's a kind of a one diff, one thesis thing here. Like he's just going to solve that one blocker problem rather than trying to do it as part of the main work. And so you can see that he's doing a very surgical early pull request here. It's super easy to understand. I'm not going to go through the code now, but basically it was one parameter that needed to cascade through 2 or 3 functions. Very easy for me to read. Very easy for me to feel confident that he's thought through how the code works. And basically I was able to accept and land this pull request within a couple of days. Very, very simple. But I've now built up even more confidence in his abilities. And then thirdly, when he comes to land the main feature, I'm getting a good sense about this work. So this is the follow-on where he's actually landing the majority of the work. And this is a much larger, more complicated pull request, but it's got I'm on the hook, right? As a maintainer, I'm like, okay, now I really want to see this land. I'm committed. He's committed. We know we're going to make this work. And as it happens, he actually, hit a few challenges along the way with the testing for it. So, I had to, help out, make a few changes to the pull request myself. But by this point, like, we're on a mission, the two of us, right, to get this thing done. So we landed it, and it went on to become a flagship feature of the next release of Tinybase, the PowerSync integration. And I was able to work with the PowerSync team to do some promotion and blah blah blah. It was all wonderful. But I think this goes to show how, from my point of view as a maintainer, this contributor has really helped win my trust, really helped earn my confidence, and when we come to actually land it, we know we're working as a team. Now, if you contrast this with what he could have done, which would have been to put all the code together, no context, and just dump it on me. Here's a big piece of code. I'd be like, who are you? What is this? I don't even know what PowerSync is. Why are there bits of code all over the place? I would be very wary of accepting that. But Benedict was able to take me through this step by step, and it was a much more successful result. So be like Benedict. I think, it's a very, very successful way to introduce yourself to a project and then go on to become a longer term contributor. Let's say it's a repo that you already use. It's a need. There's a need that you already have. There's already an issue open for it. This is the perfect situation. Like what I was just talking about with a large complicated pull request was one thing, but honestly, if you're just looking for a nice, easy, stars align kind of approach, if you spot a repo that's got a problem that you can uniquely fix, I would say go for it. Start coding, ship it, get in there, and it's probably kind of the easier approach. To do this, you're going to need to look through what the existing requirements are. So as we mentioned earlier, go to the Issues tab on someone else's repo. You'll quickly get a sense of what the issues are. This is the list of current Tinybase issues that I've identified. Some of them are bugs that other people have filed. Some of them are requests that I want to have done, things that I'm not necessarily going to do myself, but which someone else could perhaps do. Go through those, see if anything takes your fancy. I guess it's not always obvious as an external contributor when you're looking at an issue to know if it's a big issue that's going to require a massive project to solve, or whether it's something very small, maybe just a small typo or a very small bug. So I'm not very good at this on Tinybase, but other projects are, and that's to go through and actually tag the issues accordingly. I think we looked at this again earlier when we were looking at how to understand the health of a project. But when you see issues tagged like this, you can get a very good sense of what is good for you as a contributor to work on. So this is actually Yarn, I think, which is a JavaScript package manager, and it's a project where I felt the issues had been particularly well triaged. And what you'll see is that each issue has been tagged as ones where help is wanted. This is something that maintainers are not able to take on, or it's something that's a new feature versus a bug. And I think another very interesting tag that they use here is the good first issue tag. Great. If you're looking to get involved with the project right from the start, find something where it says help wanted. Find something where it says good first issue. That's likely to be one where it's a problem that can be solved quite easily. It's one which doesn't require a deep understanding of the entire repository. Perhaps it's just something that's very isolated, and the maintainers have decided that that's a good one for someone like you to get involved. In fact, from the maintainer's point of view, it's pretty awesome. I should do this more on Tinybase probably. It's pretty awesome to go through and add these, because now I'm making it much easier for people to get involved. It's a very good way to grow the community. So yeah, if you found a project and the issues are tagged well like this, it really helps give you a roadmap, or give you a lay of the land, so that you can help to see where your work can be the most effective. Just dipping your toes into a project and you're still a little bit nervous about getting involved with a big pull request, or maybe even a smaller one, and solving some issues, there are ways that you can help out that are even light on the software itself. And don't rule these out, because these are, in a sense, just as valuable a way to get involved with the community and make the project a better place. So let's run through a few of these. One is triaging issues, which, as I had previously mentioned, is actually a very important part of running a project. If it's a very popular project, people are filing lots of bugs, not all those bugs are equal. Some of them are going to be important, some of them are going to be very minor, some of them are going to be hard to solve, some of them are going to be easy to solve, some of them might not even reproduce very easily. And so the act of actually going through those issues, particularly if there's a large number, and helping to categorize them, helping to tag them, is itself a very valuable contribution that you can make. So you don't even have to open your IDE, you don't even have to write a line of code. You could potentially jump in, start helping to classify some of those issues. Again, Might be worth talking to the maintainers before you start doing this. They might be a bit surprised to see someone coming along and tagging all of these issues. And I think maybe you might even need permission to be able to do that on some repos. But you're making the project a better place by classifying these issues, helping to reproduce them, commenting on them, saying, yeah, I think this is valid. I've been able to reproduce it myself. And then in turn, that helps other people who want to contribute know what those better issues are to contribute. Working on documentation. Unfortunately, not many open source projects prioritize documentation as much as they could. And you'll often find that the READMEs get out of date, or the wiki pages get out of date, or the APIs aren't well documented. Maybe there's some work you can do to help out here. And this is another great place where you can make a big impact very quickly without necessarily needing to understand the code in a deep and profound way. So volunteer to help out with code. I mean, it's a little bit light to just go through fixing typos, but that's not a bad way to fix the fix the overall quality of the project and get familiar with the flow of what it takes to contribute. People who I know come along and fix a few typos to start with, then go on to becoming more longer-term contributors, maybe writing more and more documentation once they see that that's adding value. So yeah, don't be afraid to do that. As a maintainer, I always love it when someone's found some nonsensical sentence I've written or some typo that needs fixing. It's also nice as a maintainer to know that somebody's reading it and they found that, right? So don't be afraid to jump in on the documentation, which also, by the way, extends to doing things like the type definitions. So let's say it's a JavaScript project or it's written in TypeScript. A lot of the documentation might actually be built into the type system and into the declaration files. You can do quite a lot there to help annotate the functions or annotate the parameters the functions take and maybe describe what they are and help out there as well. Website design. Again, maintainers may have an opinion about how their website looks, but very often that's just something that doesn't get prioritized. And if you're someone with a bit of design expertise or some look and feel opinions that can come and help make the website look a little smarter, again, maintainers will be very happy to have you, I'm sure. Again, probably worth mentioning to the maintainers that this is something you're going to do, but you can jump in, add some CSS, add some layout changes, maybe make sure the website works well on mobile, but it doesn't. So, how are you going to help add mobile support to a repo's documentation? Again, code light, still very valuable. Translations, that's another great one. If you're a non-native speaker, let's assume that the project is in English and the main part of the documentation is in English, but you want to help the project expand into other locales. Maybe you can help translate the language of the website or the documentation, or do the translations for the wiki pages. If it's a well-run project, it might already have internationalization, making it easier for you to pick up that kind of work. It's a bit of a longer-term commitment, potentially, if you're then expected to maintain that other language documentation over time, because, of course, the original documentation is also changing, so you need to keep them in sync. But super valuable contribution to a project, and, again, something that will help you understand how it works yourself. And again, if you're an active user of a repo, you are a valid stakeholder in its success. So don't be afraid to go and comment on pull requests or comment on other issues. Do something better than just saying me too. But you could say, look, yeah, I also have this issue, or I've been able to reproduce it in a more precise way, or no, I can't reproduce that under my conditions. Like if it's a particular issue and people are having trouble diagnosing what it is, you can help jump in and help the triage process, comment and review other pull requests, all of which is going to help raise your profile, but also help you get a better sense of how the project works. Long story short, there are many, many ways that you can contribute to open source projects, and anything you do is going to get your name noticed. It's going to get your avatar familiar in people's eyes. It's going to help you get appreciated and builds your relationship with the rest of the community. So it's worth talking about the broader ecosystem outside the repo itself. I've made it sound like everything happens inside the GitHub repository, and to a certain extent, the majority of the work will happen in there, but there's a world outside that too. And there's a broader ecosystem of social media, conferences, Discord, Slack, Stack Overflow, etc., where a community lives. And I think you can play a role there as well. So think about how you can become an advocate for the project. Think about how you can promote the project on social media. You've become a user of it, or there's something you think is particularly awesome about it, and you want to tell the world, then go for it, right? The maintainers are going to love seeing that good news getting out there. They're going to love to see the credibility that you're giving them. And just getting mentions on social media is obviously going to be good for the health of the project. Write articles. Publish them on your own blog, or publish them in some other, online place like, I don't know, Medium, or some developer forum, wherever. Think about writing guides. Think about writing training courses. You could even put together training courses of your own for how to use a project and potentially build a business on it, right? There are plenty of people now who have whole projects built around React and the training that they give around React. And there's a lot more that you can do well beyond the boundaries of the repository itself. So definitely think about that. We used to say at Facebook that the best advocate is one that doesn't work for the company. Yes, there's the core team that's working on a project, but then there's this next ring of people who have a vested interest in seeing your success because they're running training courses, or they're building businesses, or they're an agency, web design agency that wants to start using your technology in order to sell that in turn to their clients, right? This whole ecosystem needs to come together to make things successful. And you can play a role in that. And so I think it's important to find out where this ecosystem exists, talk to this community, but not only where it already exists, but also where it isn't. Like, let's say you have a particular influence in, one particular space, and you've seen a project that's over there and you think that's really interesting. How can you bring the good news about that project into the community that already knows, that you already know? And helping to bridge those divides is a super valuable thing to do. So anyway, those are just a couple of ideas about how you can help contribute in a broader ecosystem. The specific example, I wanted to call up React. I'm sorry I keep using React as an example, but there's a lot of things you can learn from the growth of that particular project. This is the growth in the GitHub stars of the React project in its first few years. And one thing you'll see is that this has a couple of very distinct inflection points. When it was first launched, you'll see there was a fairly flat period for almost a year or so after it launched, in which people didn't really understand React. They didn't really get the growth that the team was hoping for. But something happened, and that thing was somebody wrote an article about React. A guy called David Nolan, Swan Odette, I think was his handle, on Twitter. You can probably still find him there. And he worked in the ClojureScript world, so it was kind of adjacent to React, but it wasn't directly part of the React team. And he wrote an article talking about React and how he was using it with his own project. And that directly corresponded to a bump in interest in React that you can see in this graph. It's like super clear. Now, to be honest, I don't think the React team knew this was happening, right? He just went off and wrote a blog post. I think it hit Hacker News, got a bunch of interest around it. But that was a seminal moment in the growth of the React project, ironically, because after that you can see there was not only a bump, but then there was the start of this kind of exponential curve. The second inflection point was something similar. A few years later, Netflix wrote an article saying that they started using React and how they were using it on some of their TV and viewer interfaces. And again, don't think that the React team knew that this was coming. The Netflix team just went out and published this and talked about what they had learned and the pros and the cons. But again, big bump in the inflection, the gradient of the stars graph. And I guess you could say the rest is history. This graph is not right up to the current day, but like it's obviously gone on to become even more successful ever since then. But what I wanted to do is stress that there were these two key moments very, very early in this project where people outside the project had made a huge difference. And I don't know, that could be you. You could be making a huge difference to an open source project literally just by spreading the good news about it into your community and helping do your part from what might seem like the sidelines, but in a way that can end up being very material. Quickly, let's just run through a few final other options, ways that you can get involved with the project beyond writing the code directly and working with the broader ecosystem. So I do want to remind you that covering this in this talk, but there is always that option of starting your own project. Have you spotted a gap not within a particular repository, but just in the world in general that needs to be solved? Could you go out and build a project from scratch? I think this is awesome. I've done it myself. But I think if you're looking to make open source part of your overall portfolio, your overall experience, it's a little bit higher risk as a strategy. It takes a lot to get a project going. It takes a lot to get it adopted, and there's no guarantee that it'll even happen. And it would be a shame for you to invest years and years of work and then still end up with a project that's not very well known or that's not really helping to burnish your credentials in the same way that maybe working with an existing one have. That said, if it does work, it's incredibly successful. Obviously, there are many people who have initiated projects that have gone on to become super successful, who are now complete rock stars and very famous and probably would have no trouble getting a job. So the rewards are huge, but the risk is also high. So we're not talking about this specifically in this course, but it is, I guess, it's one of those outside, but the rewards are higher if you do succeed. But I do think there's a hybrid here, which is worth exploring, which is you see a project that you really like, but you're not quite sure how to contribute to the core part of it, but you'd like to do something that's kind of got a little bit more autonomy of your own. And if you've found a project that's got a good extensibility model or a good plugin model, this is actually quite a good approach. So, sometimes you'll find there are subdirectories down inside the main repo where there are, connectors to other systems or, extensions that work with different front-end frameworks or different databases or what have you. Sometimes those are places where you can operate a little bit more autonomously without damaging or without working too directly on the main project, but which give you a bit of freedom to iterate quickly. And sometimes these are even off in completely separate repos, so you need to kind of keep your eyes open for them. But yeah, this is a great way maybe to get your visibility within the community, but maybe not be held back by the protocols and the maintainers of the core project. So yeah, maybe a good way to get started, getting a little bit of the best of both worlds, something of your own, and yet also helping to make a larger project more successful. This is a good example of a project like that. So this is Vite, which is a kind of a front-end build tool. And in fact, if you go and look at Vite, the core Vite project is a repo inside an organization that's called Vite. And one of the things that you'll see is that inside that organization, alongside the core project, are a bunch of other projects, plugins for React or for Vue or for whatever other build systems there are. And so this is interesting because you might think to yourself, I wonder, can I contribute to maybe some of those more auxiliary things? Vite itself is kind of like pretty high profile hardcore thing, but maybe some of the projects around it are a little faster moving and some way that you can kind of work your way into the community. Here's another kind of view on what those things are. There's a website called Awesome Vite, where they actually list out what all those different plugins are. These are not all hosted by the Vite project, by the way. Some of these are hosted off in other places. But these are all projects that are out on GitHub, some of which may require you to help out, some of which you could maybe take over if they've been abandoned or whatever. You're still helping to make Vite as a whole more successful. You're able to do it in this kind of plugin ecosystem, which is often a faster place to work, right? Often easier for you to iterate on things quickly. Or maybe just start a new plugin that doesn't exist. You want to connect Veep to something that doesn't, no one's done before, and you can just get it on there, add it to the list, and work your way into the community's awareness that way. Like, how do you find the open source community? And there's no one answer to this because every community is different. Many big repos will have some other medium for their discussions, not just GitHub, but there'll be possibly a Discord. The link will often be in the repos README or on their website. There might be a Slack, although those sometimes get a little bit out of control. There might be a Telegram or some other messaging system. And those are the places where you're most likely to be able to communicate directly with the core maintainers or the very active community members. Now, you got to watch out that those don't get too noisy. Sometimes it's users asking for help. Sometimes it's maintainers answering questions about code contributions. Sometimes it's just random spam. So, try to find the channel. If you're looking to contribute, try to find the channel that's relevant to the contributors, or places where you can help ask questions about the work that you're going to be doing. There are other places, depends on the repo, but you might find there are, for the larger projects, Reddit communities. That's often a good place for you to do show and tell. Oh, I built a plugin for X, let's go to the, or X or Y, let's go to the Reddit groups for X or Y, and then talk about the project that we've launched. Obviously the GitHub discussions page, Twitter /X itself is a reasonable place if a project has a handle, an account of its own already, obviously tagging, mentioning, replying to the conversations on there. And even LinkedIn, which is a bit surprising, but you might find that there are maybe sector-specific or technology-specific groups in LinkedIn. I think there's a HTML and JavaScript group, for example. There's a data infrastructure group, for example. And if you've helped work on a project, or you've written an article about an open source project, or you've launched an important new feature for a project, be careful with picking the right kind of community. But there are places on LinkedIn where you could announce that, and you're definitely going to start reaching people outside of the tent to grow the reputation and the influence and the awareness of a project. So yeah, don't be afraid to look a little bit further afield. I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth still coming back to. There's a balance between going off, becoming a complete kind of like solo traveler and doing all this stuff on your own, or getting bogged down with the kind of the minutiae and the protocols and the complexity of contributing. The key to figuring out where to be on that spectrum is about communication. And I'll keep coming back to this point, but like open source is only partly about the code, right? More than anything, it's about the interactions that you're going to have with the maintainers, the other contributors, the key users, the other people that are interested in projects. So, if all else fails, make sure you are communicating, and not just in a one-way, one-way street kind of way with these communities. Make sure that you're listening as much as you're speaking, you're asking as much as you're answering, and you're always looking for help, making people aware of what you're going to do before you do it, minimizing the surprises. And that's the key to really building your reputation as a trustworthy member of an open source community. So just to summarize, I really want to emphasize the best ways to engage with an open source community. And this is the main point. Make sure you give more than you take. Make sure that it's not a one-way street. Make sure that you're as gracious and benevolent as you can be. A lot of the other people working in this project are doing so in their spare time as well. A lot of these people have got a huge workload, both in and out of work. So make sure that you're not putting a drain on the community, you're not putting a drain on the project. Make sure you are offering everything you can and being as kind and as generous as you can be. Once you get up to speed with the repo, we've talked about the journey you probably go on to become familiar with how things work, but there are people behind you who want to do that too. And you can play a huge role in helping to pave the path that you've made you've cut your way through the jungle to figure out what's going on. Maybe make it easier for the next person. Might mean writing some documentation about what you've found, writing a guide to what it was like to get on board. The maintainers are going to notice this. They're going to notice you coming through the ranks. They're going to notice you being the one that's always helping. And if it's a corporate project, like, these are people that are going to notice you potentially as a future colleague, and they might be the sorts of people that are aware of professional opportunities that involve these skills. So you want to make sure that you're on their radar. You want to make sure that you're giving them as good an impression as possible right from the start. If you are hoping to become a future employee at this company, these are the kinds of behaviors they're going to be wanting to see in those people. Not just your coding skills, of course, your coding skills, but in addition, all of these, benevolent, helpful, team-playing style behaviors that are going to make it much easier for them to welcome you into their community, into their company, and for you to then become very successful once you're there. Let's talk a little bit about learning the codebase of a new open source project that you would like to get involved with. And this is a non-exhaustive guide to doing this, but hopefully we'll give you just a few pointers for what to do. And hopefully it goes without saying that many of the skills that you'll learn in figuring out how to work with a code base in the open source world are going to be similar to the skills that you need to work with a code base in a professional environment too. Remember, joining and contributing to an open source project is like a dry run for joining and contributing to a company. And so I can't guarantee I'll tell you everything you need to know here. It's an acquired skill, but we'll run through hopefully some ideas to get you started. It's one of the most important skills, both in and outside of the professional environment. It's all very well when you've written your own code and you can remember how everything works, but now you've got to put yourself into an environment where everything is unfamiliar. You didn't write any of this code. You didn't know what was going through the programmer's brain when they wrote it. And you've got to try to understand their intent, the purpose of the code, what their opinions are. And it's, again, not just for open source, but something that you'll need to be able to do in a professional environment too. There are some smart approaches, which hopefully we'll be able to cover. And let's start off by thinking about how to understand the basics of the code base. And I'm sorry for the cliched picture of the trees, but it is all about seeing the wood for the trees. Your goal is not to read every single line of code in an open source repository and try to understand it. For any medium to large size project, that is basically impossible. And if you're joining a large tech company, I can absolutely guarantee that is humanly impossible. There is no way you could read and understand every line of code at Google or Facebook or Apple. So you're never going to be able to get to that point. And even for a small project, it's often very difficult to kind of understand literally every line of code. So the key is just understanding the bigger picture. Why does this whole section of code exist, rather than what does this individual line do? There we go. Make sure you see the forest and not the trees. Here are some of the questions that are worth asking when you're first approaching a new code base. The first thing is obviously just how is it laid out? And we've talked a lot about GitHub and how the projects are structured. So is that different projects are laid out in different ways. So this is Vue, which is a front-end framework. And you'll see that the Vue organization is kind of an umbrella for lots of sub-projects. So I think maybe when it started, Vue was a single project, but then as it grew, it kind of graduated to becoming a parent umbrella. And now inside that organization are the specific projects that constitute the major components of Vue as a whole. So there's Vue Core, there's the Vue storage engine, there's the documentation, there's the router, there's the developer tools, there are tools for creating new Vue projects, and these are all now split out into separate projects. I often stumble upon the core version of a thing, and I can't understand how it all works, and it's often because the key piece I needed is not there, but it's up and over, and it's in a neighboring directory or a neighboring project. So sometimes it's worth just popping up a level, seeing how the overall organization is structured, and then get a sense of how these individual modules relate to each other. Inside a given project, of course, the code itself is going to be the main pointer for how things are structured. GitHub has this kind of linear view of the file structure, so you can see the top level folders, you can see the top level files. Unfortunately, these aren't always that instructive at the very, very top level. Depends on the kind of language and the environment, but you'll often see a whole bunch of configuration files at the top level. You'll see the README, you'll see the changelog, you'll see the license file, a bunch of funding stuff. So there's always a little bit of noise at the top level. So often what you need to do is identify a project folder called something like packages in this case, or lib, or modules, and then that's often where the actual kind of heart of the project exists, a level or two down. This again is a screenshot from Vue, and this is down inside Vue /core /packages, and boom, there's the compiler core. It's like, okay, this is where the project really is, so to speak. So worth navigating down. I personally don't enjoy navigating around the GitHub UI like this too much, so it's often worth checking out the code. So you've got it locally, then you can use either the file explorer of your IDE or your file explorer of the operating system to navigate around. It's also easier to find things if you're looking for a particular keyword or you just want to know how one thing works. So yeah, before you even do this, you might want to just check out the code or download as a zip file or check it out in Git, so that you can find things more easily. It's really worth understanding what it will take to get the code running. At some point you're going to have to build this thing if you're hoping to contribute to it, and many well-run projects will have a wiki page like this where it talks about the development setup. This is key, not just because it'll identify what the modules are that you need to really focus on, but it talks about the dependencies, it talks about things you need to have installed, talks about particular operating system versions that you might need to have, other build environment projects. You need TypeScript if it's a front-end project. You need to install pip if it's a Python project, and there'll be lots of pointers hopefully to scripts or recipes you need for getting up and running. So yeah, always go looking for a contributing.md file or a wiki page or something on their website that talks about what it takes to be a contributor. Lots of clues in there. In terms of actual entry points to the code, this is always a bit hit and miss, but it does help if you can understand where the if you like, the front door to the code base is. And if you are the sort of person like me who likes to step into the code, working through it, and in the same way the logic or the data flows, then finding the entry points are critical. There'll often be a top level file that has all the exports in it. Okay, this is JavaScript or TypeScript, but the same concepts apply in other languages as well. And here I can see immediately I've got the exports for all the option files, all the translation or transformation files, all the context files. There's a file being generated at the bottom there, or exported, called generate. Okay, that sounds pretty important. So see if you can identify that top level file, start clicking through. If you've got it locally, then you might even be able to click through in your editor, go through each of these things one by one, figure out what the important stuff is. But if it's being exported publicly, it's probably an important entry point. And the other place that I often like to start looking is if the project has a command line interface. Even if it's a front-end framework or a back-end database system, you will still find somewhere there's a CLI. And these are kind of helpful because you get to see, this is the code for the CLI, but you can get to see all the options that are being provided on the command line. You can get to see from here what parts of the system are being invoked when you run something on the command line. So I guess that's both the entry point for a human, but it's also an entry point into the code, and you're getting to see from there the things that are being imported. It's a kind of a nice kind of like I guess a mixture of abstraction, but also like a low-level way in to how the project as a whole works. So yeah, if you can identify a CLI file, it's a nice trick to open some doors. Another thing to figure out is what the important modules are within an open source project. And you know, if it's a large project, these can be a little elusive, trying to figure out what really matters and what doesn't. You are really looking for things that are core classes, things that are maybe at the bottom of the class hierarchy if it's object-oriented, or pieces of code that are very hot. Lots of, you know, nearly all the logic goes through it. You'll often find that there are configuration items that are used throughout the code base, and if you can understand those, you're going to understand how everything works, especially if it's kind of some global configuration that is actually then materialized throughout the software. So understanding what those are, because you're going to see them over and over again, and you need to understand what they are. Are there any particularly hot functions? Now this is a little tricky to tell just by looking at the code, but is this a function that's being called tens of millions of times through the life cycle of an execution? Because that's going to be both a function that's very important, but also one you're going to have to be very careful about touching. And yeah, this is not always easy to find, but one of the things you can do if you've got the code checked out and you're in a position to be able to build it, you know, maybe put some logging in to some of the functions and start seeing where the spew is coming from. And if you spot that there's one function that's getting called all the time, you should tag that mentally, okay, that's a key place that I need to understand. Either, you know, understand that it's going to be important, or understand not to touch it if it's, you know, if you think it's a key part of the system that might become a performance bottleneck, for example. Utility classes, utility functions, they're always worth understanding. They're maybe not critical, but they do give you a good understanding of you know, things that you know, functions that you're going to see popping up throughout the code base. And then I think most importantly, figuring out how the data flows through a project is super important. Like, what is the philosophy behind how data moves throughout the system? Are data structures immutable, for example? Or are they changed? Are they global, or are they manipulated locally? Are they committed to a database? Are they updated optimistically or pessimistically? Lots of different questions. Are there schemas about, you know, how the data is structured? By the way, if you're trying to understand the code base and you can find some schemas, that's actually a really nice way to kind of get a sense of what's possible with the system. You know, what are the key fields? What are the mandatory fields in the data that's being moved around? Those are the ones that matter more than the ones that are perhaps optional. Where is the data stored, of course, is super critical. Is it in a database? Is it in memory? You know, what are the rules around maybe sharding the data across different media? What are the rules around replicating the data across different systems? Under what conditions does that happen? What are the abstractions? Is this a piece of software that works raw against data that's going into a database, or is it using an ORM, some kind of abstraction? Super important to understand. ORMs both help and hinder, in my opinion. An ORM is kind of a nice way to understand the business logic of the data, but it also means you've got to like click a couple of extra times down inside the code base to figure out what's really happening when the data hits the disk. And then there's the API side of things, like how is the data being either put into the system or taken out of the system? Is there an RPC layer, remote procedure calls, or are there REST or GraphQL APIs? If so, what are their conventions? How do people call this data? What are they getting out when they do so? What are the things that can be changed? I don't mention it on this slide, but there's also the topic of authentication and security around the data. How do you know which parts of the data can be manipulated and which cannot? The humans behind the code base. It's all very well understanding where the core code is and how the data moves and everything else, but you've got to think about the humans too and what are their opinions. And this can be as simple as just what is the style of the code, what is the choice between tabs and spaces in this code base, how are variables named, how are braces placed on new lines, how are variables capitalized. These are all things that, on the surface of things are kind of cosmetic, but this is a representation of the humans that are working on this code base. And I'm sure you've come across a code base where a very different set of decisions have been made to the ones you're familiar with, and it can be a little strange at first getting up to speed on that different dialect, if you like. It's important for you to understand the language of the repo you're working in, and I don't just mean literally the language, but I mean the syntax that's being used and the style that's being used. Because if you're trying to make a contribution, you need to kind of fall in line with that, I'm afraid to say, right? You're not coming and redesigning the style system for the code base. You're hopefully coming along and making a change to the functionality of it. And you need to do that, with those guidelines rather than against them. There may be particular linting and formatting preferences that a project has. There are linting tools for most programming languages. There are formatting tools for most programming languages. If you're writing code for this code base, make sure you've got them installed. It'll save you a whole bunch of grief later on when you're trying to submit the pull request, and it'll make your life a lot easier. Unfortunately, there are sometimes competing lint systems and competing formatting options, so you'll need to make sure that you're using the one that the repo already has. And there are unwritten rules as well, which I'm afraid you may not find in a style guide, but you may only be able to find out by reading around the code itself, looking to see how the existing maintainers or the existing authors have been working in a code base. Just try to get yourself into their into their style, so that when you're making contributions for them, it looks to them like something they would have written, rather than something they have to add that extra mental overhead to understand. If, of course, there isn't a style guide and you find yourself trying to figure out what's going on in the code base, maybe there should be a style guide to make it easier. As we've mentioned, you should be paving the path for people like you in the future. And one of the things you could do if there's no style guide or there are no linting rules in place is to establish that for a project. You're helping the maintainers, you're helping the people that are going to come after you, you're making the world a better place. So yeah, think about maybe offering up your services to create a style guide, even if it's just a sparse skeleton of such a thing, to get the ball rolling. Maybe even start implementing the first set of lint rules or the first set of formatting rules for a project. Definitely do it with the authors or the contributors, the original contributors, kind of say so. Like, definitely something you want to reach out to them about first. Because I think just turning up and wholesale reformatting someone's project or laying down the rules about what it should look like, it's kind of a bold move for a first-time contributor. So definitely only do that if the contributor is, or the original maintainers are happy for you to do so. It's a little bit of a turn-off for someone to turn up and say, no, I think your code should be formatted like this. So, be very empathetic. You're a guest to start off with. You want to help, but make sure you're doing so in a constructive and a gracious way. Touched on this a bunch of times, but I'm going to stress it again. Always be thinking about how you can share what you learn as you go on your journey into an open source project, and pave the way for people to follow you. If you found it tricky to get up and running, if you found the code difficult to understand, then others will as well. So every time you understood something new, think about how you can pass that on to the next person. Feel free to add comments to the code, or write wiki pages, or write articles, either in or outside the repo, about what you understood or what you were able to reverse engineer. And maybe even file PRs, make changes to the code base to make things a little easier to understand. It's a valid contribution. Again, if you've got the approval, or at least you've been communicating with the maintainers, I think anything that helps other people get on board easier is going to be very welcome in the grand scheme of things. I want to point to one particular example of someone who did this. It's a little dated now. I think it's probably 2012 or so. I should have checked the date, but this is a YouTube video by Paul Irish, and this was a presentation that he gave called the 10 things that he learned about the jQuery source, or from the jQuery source. And it's a pretty awesome video that goes through jQuery, which at the time was the kind of the predominant or the major front-end framework. And he talks about what he found as he went on that journey, the style of code that he saw, the way that it had been structured. And he's not just talking about like the project, but also what he's learning as an engineer as he goes through understanding it. So it's a super interesting journey that he goes on, and Paul Irish has gone on to become extremely successful, in his career as a result. This video was just one of the things that he did that helped raise, the awareness of how he thought about the world and things that he was able to do for the community. But this is a fantastic example of where he just sat down for a couple of hours, maybe a little more, but he left an artifact, or he left a map, a roadmap of what that journey was that he had gone through, that helped other people get familiar with the code base. And I think that's a fantastic example of what can be done if you have that particular mindset when approaching a new code base. All right, eventually you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and start doing things. You can get stuck reading a code base forever. I mean, I say days here, but it could be weeks, could be months, could be longer. If you're committed to reading every line of the Linux code base before you make a contribution, you're probably never going to actually finish, and you're never going to make any contributions. So at some point, you're going to have to call it and say, look, I want to make a contribution, and let's do it. Otherwise, you're just going to get frustrated and, not really helping anything. So time to get in, try some coding, try some debugging, see if you can figure out what's going on. Once you've got a good sense of the overall structure of the code, you're just going to have to dive in. It's good experience to think about the debugging process to do this. Now, debugging is probably a whole other topic in its own right. We don't have time to cover in detail in this course. But I think there are some key things to be aware of. If you picked a task, something you want to work on, you think you found the relevant code, you're running it locally, there's nothing to stop you covering this thing in console log or printf or whatever the syntax is for logging, and you can run this locally, start playing around, see what the behavior is of the code when you change it. Don't be afraid. Don't forget, even if you're committing to your local repo, you're not damaging the upstream main version of this project. You can go completely crazy. You can completely destroy it if you want. You can always revert all your changes. So I think just be bold. Take that leap of faith. Start hacking around. Add print statements. Add breakpoints if your debugging environment supports it. Just change random lines of code and see what happens. Maybe there's some magic number and you don't know why it's there. Well, increase the number and see what breaks, or decrease the number, see what breaks. It'll get you some familiarity with the code. It'll also get you some familiarity with that build cycle. So when you're actually starting to make meaningful contributions, you're going to need to have the muscle memory required to build, test, run it locally, validate all the changes you've made. And you can get a sense of that flow right from the beginning. In contrast, if you just try fixing the issue or making the contribution right up front, you've written what you think is the perfect code, but now you don't even know how to compile the software, you're going to be in a whole world of pain. So much better to just be making small cosmetic changes first, use it as a chance to kick the tires on the build process, that inner loop of building the software, so that when you start doing something more meaningful, you can be quicker and more effective at it. It's time to make some contributions to an open source project, and this is the moment we've all been waiting for. We've touched on this already, but I think it's important to start with something small. It's going to be easier for you, it's going to be easier for the maintainers to understand what you're doing. Your goal with your very first pull request is to get familiar with the workflow, get familiar with the process of building, debugging, committing, and then putting something up for review. You're going to get to do bigger pieces of work in the future, but it's pretty awesome to have done some smaller ones up front just to build up your confidence and get familiar with that workflow. So firstly, think about how to fork the project. If it's GitHub, most projects have a fork button. This will create a local to you version of the repository. You can then clone down to your local machine and start building from there. Often you'll find that projects have templated pull request forms, which means when you've made the change and you've made the commits and you then submit it as a proposed change to the project, there's a set of questions that they want you to ask, or answer, I should say. There's going to be a particular style to how you name and document your commits so that the maintainers know what it is. And I think the best way, at least for your first project, is to think of this as, quote, boot camp. Many large tech companies have a boot camp where when you first join it into the culture, the engineering culture of the company. And think of this as that, right? You're not trying to impress people with some heroic set of changes. You're just trying to get yourself familiar with how everything works. So take on a low complexity task first. You want to build that muscle memory. You want to get your name known. If you take on a big task, you're going to be struggling not only with the change, but also with the workflow. So it's good to kind of break those two pieces apart. And maintainers probably aren't going to accept your change if it's a huge, complicated one anyway. So start small. I think I used this screenshot earlier in the course, but I just want to reiterate that when you're trying to find something to work on, the ones that are tagged with help wanted or tagged with good first task are particularly good ones to start with. If you are putting up a pull request against one of these, then the maintainers, they're likely to be much more tolerant because they know that you're accepting this first task. It's much more likely to be a small atomic change. So yeah, if you can tie your change, your very first project to one of these, then I think you're going to find it a lot easier a path to getting the code committed. So forking is all about making a copy of the repository into your own account. That's normally a button on the top right-hand side of a repo. And you can either press that button, or I think if you start editing or trying to edit a file in the GitHub user interface, it'll fork it for you. Either way, you want to get a local copy of this project or a personal copy of this project. Then pull that down to your local device. Start making changes and committing. Then when you're pushing those commits, they're going up to your personal version of the project, not the main one. And so this is an important part of the process. There's a really good guide on the GitHub help pages about the process for forking and then creating pull requests. So we're just going to touch on some of the key parts here. When you create a fork, I think you can also fork into a corporate account if you happen to be a member of a corporate or another group already. I don't know, it makes things a little bit more complicated and much easier just to use your personal account in my experience. And you can indicate whether you want to fork all of the branches of the code or just the main one, which is the one you're typically going to be working on. Touched on this a little bit, but the pull requests that you put up, the proposals for your changes, are much more helpful for the maintainers if you are answering the questions that they have asked. And often in a project, as you can see in this case I do for Tinybase, there is a template under the .github folder. So if you see one of these, then when you come to create the pull request, you are going to get asked to answer these things. Yeah, I now know that you've thought through what the rationale for this change was. I now know how you tested things. Other projects will have many more questions than this, but that's just part of the protocol. You are hoping to make a change to someone's project. I think it's within their rights to ask you what it was you were doing and why you were making these changes. Incidentally, when you're making code commits at a large company, you're going to have to go through the same kind of process, documenting what a commit means, what you did to test it out, and so forth. The commits themselves, obviously, a little bit more granular than it's possible that you have a pull request with one commit, but often a pull request will be comprised of multiple commits. The commits themselves often have a convention behind how they're named. This is Tinybase. I tend to just put square brackets at the beginning of the title to say whether it's just some hygiene or, some change I'm making to the tests or some particular feature, or, this is the release commit. Other projects are more specific. This is one, actually, I think it's a Java project that has a convention of actually putting the number of the issue that's being fixed or the pull request that it's related to in the commit. This is pretty awesome in a way, because if you ever see a commit in the code base, you know why it existed. You can click through on that hash 671 and that'll take you through to the original issue that it was solving, or the original pull request it was a part of. And other projects get even more elaborate with this, where there are conventions around using emojis to indicate different types of commit. Is this, fixing a bug, or is it adding a feature, or is it just bumping dependencies, or what have you? And you can get a little bit out of control with these, and you might start forgetting what the emojis all mean at some point. But again, you're trying to swim with the tide, or go with the flow on someone else's project. So try to meet them where they are, so that they understand. Because once these commits are landed, right, they're going to go into probably the main branch, and they'll be there forever. So it's nice if you can make them look like part of a whole set, rather than something that's just your weird and wonderful naming convention. Try to go with the flow. In researching this, I have never used this, but I discovered there is actually a convention for commit titles that many projects cite and use. This is the conventional commit quote standard, and this is interesting. I've seen increasing numbers of projects start to adopt this, where the title is made up of the different parts of metadata about a commit, what it relates to, whether it's just a bug fix or a feature, clear explanation, maximum length, whether it affects a certain issue or not. And so yeah, if a project is using this, worth becoming familiar with that particular standard. All of this comes down to knowing the protocols of an open source project inside and out. And yes, every project has slightly different rules and slightly different expectations, and I'm afraid it's on you to get familiar with them. You can't bring your own set of rules and expect them to work in every project that you contribute to. Most major repos will have contribution guidelines. It'll be in either the README at the top level, or maybe a contributing file. Contributing.md is often the extension used. Read through it. It'll have lots of helpful information, but it'll also have what the maintainers consider to be important conventions for you to apply. So when you first join the repo, yeah, definitely read through that. Every time you make a major change, go back through that, double check that you've done everything they've asked for. And when you put up a PR, self-review this. You're saving the reviewer a bunch of effort if you have already gone through and read it with their eyes, so to speak. Make sure all the tests pass, for example. But again, I've said this many times, going to keep repeating it. Make sure you communicate with the maintainers, and make sure they're still actively aware of what it is you're working on. Other good practices in general, especially once your contributions start to grow in size, make sure that the commits themselves are suitably atomic. There's something called the one diff, one thesis rule or principle, which is that every commit you make should be solving one problem, and ideally one problem only, and isn't trying to do lots of different things at the same time. And the reason is that if someone's reading this in the future, or if someone's reviewing it, they can look just through one single lens. They get a complete picture of what it's doing. Every change that's in that one diff has a test case that is being applied, and there's no spaghetti being introduced because it's affecting this, and it's also affecting this, and it's also affecting this. Now, this can be remarkably hard to do. You might think it's easy to break down a larger piece of work into smaller commits, but often it's tricky because you need to touch the dependencies before you touch the dependents, or you need to get things just right before, in some service, before you can build the user interface that uses it. Sometimes you have to have latent functionality that's sitting there but isn't being used yet. Sometimes you have to hide things behind feature flags or behind gatekeepers. So it can add a little bit of complexity, but it helps you become a better engineer ultimately, because you're thinking about the modularization, you're thinking about those boundaries, and yes, it's making it easier for the reviewer, but also forcing yourself to do this makes you a better engineer. Oh, we talked a little bit about making sure the commits have got conventional titles, but also make sure the PR, the pull request itself, has a good title. The commits are going to be in the code base forever, so make sure they explain clearly what they do. Add context, a link to the issue if that's relevant. Test plan. Every commit ideally should have a test plan, either an existing test that you're pointing to. It used to pass. I'm committing this code. It still passes. Or I'm adding something new that wasn't being tested, and so I have also added a test that is relevant to this, so that you can see that my change is doing what I thought it was. Run the linters, run the code formatters. It's possible that the maintainers have set up a CI system to do that for you, but it's also worth doing it locally, just because it's probably a quicker loop, feedback loop, to make sure that things are good. And yeah, maybe some of those formatting guidelines are automated, but some of them are going to be manual too. Make sure you've gone through all of those. TLDR, this isn't the only place you're going to need to have these skills, but definitely worth taking the level up your code quality as a software engineer course on Taro, and covers a lot of these same topics there. Again, an abiding theme that we've covered throughout this open source course. Many of the skills you're learning here are going to be the same skills that you need in a professional environment. There's a famous Bruce Lee quote, which is about being like water. And what this basically means is that to be successful in life or in particular circumstances, you sort of have to flow and bend and adapt. It's sometimes very difficult to get things through by being like a rock, by being hard, by being stubborn, by being inflexible. Think about how you're going to flow like water. It always gets there in the end. It always makes its way through the landscape. It always gets to the sea one way or another, right? So how are you going to be like water? You're not going to be able to change the whole philosophy of a project by turning up and hammering it home. The maintainers aren't going to let you. So think about how to blend in, obey or follow the philosophy of the project, understand their guidelines, the styles, and make sure that you're going with that flow. Adapt your own contributions, make sure that you're fitting in, and if you want to get into an ideological battle over tabs and spaces, that's up to you, but you're not going to get any changes made. You're not going to win any credit with the maintainers. You're not going to get known as someone that's a wonderful contributor. Your network of contacts is going to shut down, and you're not going to really increase your chances of being successful in your tech career. So I would say leave the ideology at home and think about the bigger picture. This is a particular example, a counterexample, I should say. Don't really want to harp on the specifics, but it's a pull request that, should we say, went viral a little while back, where a set of changes were proposed. There was quite a bit of pushback from the community. You do not want to see a reactions ratio like this, where your proposal is really not going down well with the other users, the other community members, and with the maintainers. That's not the sign of a pull request that's going very well. As it is, the person that made this contribution is pretty experienced and did know what he was doing. But you really need to be, I think, empathetic and be as flexible as possible when you're looking to introduce changes into what ultimately was someone else's work. Another way to understand how to avoid these issues, look at other submissions. Look at what other people are doing. When in Rome, do as the Romans, as the saying goes. So if it's a well-established project, there are already going to be tens or hundreds of pull requests. Take a look at them. Read what other ones that were successful did. Maybe there is a pull request that that wasn't merged that you can learn from, but maybe there was one that was merged. Figure out what it was that made it easy to get successfully introduced into the code base. Look at ones that landed recently, so you get a sense of any sort of contemporary opinions around the code base. Find ones that are relevant to the code base that you're in. If you've decided to work down in some plugins folder, for example, take a look at the other ones around you that were in the same directory. You can work your way back up from the blame of the Git, the underlying Git commits to see what the pull requests were for the commits that are nearby where you're working. Get a sense of how those ones got submitted and what they had to go through to get them committed. Find things that are similar features, of course, and go looking for the ones that have got lots of discussion on them, not just the ones that got rubber stamped. You maybe don't learn so much from those. Look for the ones where there was a good debate, there was a healthy discussion, and you may learn more about the philosophy and the opinions of the rest of the community from those than you do from the ones that just kind of got waved through. This is a fantastic article that I found recently. I think it popped up in Hacker News, and it's definitely worth a longer read. I will only summarize it for you quickly now. But this is a blog post about a contributor who made a first-time contribution to Chromium, which is the underlying browser engine for Chrome. Now, that is a pretty scary code base in terms of its size and its complexity, and of course its impact on the world. You don't want to make a commit to the Chromium codebase that crashes, the world's browsers. So it's a fairly scary environment to work in, and yet this individual wanted to fix something that I think in the dev tools was bugging him, and he documented the process he went through. Firstly, how did he check out the code, get to understand how things worked, how to find the areas that were relevant, how to maybe get familiar with the build system. I think he came from a completely different technological background, and so like a lot of the tools weren't even familiar to him. And then once he made the change and figured out what some of the commits were, how he broke down the work, how he put together a pull request that was going to be more acceptable to the maintainers. Actually, I'm not sure it does use Git. I think they have a different submission process, but same kind of principle as a pull request. And in this case, he was interacting with 3 maintainers, right? All of whom worked on Chrome at Google, all of whom, were going to need to sign off his pull request, and all of whom probably were extremely busy with work both in and outside this code base. So he talked a lot about like how he was patient, how he worked with those individuals to get them to sign off the various pieces of what he was doing. But ultimately, he concludes how utterly rewarding the whole thing was. He got familiar with this entirely new code base that maybe he'll contribute to in the future. He fixed the bug that he needed to fix, but he also has now had his experience expanded, and he now understands this much larger technological world than he did before. And anyway, long story short, TLDR, read the article, very recommended, and sets you up with I think a very healthy mindset for making contributions of your own. Here is some of the common pushback that you might get from the community or from maintainers when you are making a pull request. First thing they're going to make sure is that your code is addressing all of the edge cases. This is a very common reason for a pull request to get challenged. You may have experienced a bug because you are using the product in a very particular way, and you fixed that one bug when used in that one particular way, but you may not be aware that that code is also being called from somewhere else, or there's some particular edge case that occurs where this code is run before something else rather than after something else like you thought. There's a whole number of reasons for edge cases to emerge in a complex code base, and you probably don't understand all that complexity, but the maintainers might do. And so you might find that they push back saying, yeah, great, congratulations, you fixed that one thing in your one particular circumstance, but you should be aware that this code also gets called in another way, or this can also happen in a different circumstance, and you should be aware that that's likely to come back as a piece of critique or commentary on your code base. And of course, you're expected to go and sew up some of those edge cases. Secondly, you could get challenged over the introduction of performance regressions, especially if it's a corporate project that's being used, maybe in a production environment. Performance is going to be very important, and a lot of projects will have a performance test suite that is being run on your code base or on the project. At Facebook, for example, we used to run a whole bunch of internal performance testing on all of our systems, many of which were dependent on open source software. And we would see what looked like a wonderful pull request coming in, but if it was slowing down Facebook.com, well, we have to kind of push back on it and make sure that performance regression is solved. So be on the lookout for those. Hopefully you'll be able to work with the maintainers to get a view of that instrumentation, so you can start to see what's exactly the problem and how you can make sure you don't We touched on this, but there's engineering culture, guidelines, conventions behind the code base. It's possible that a reviewer will call you out because you put underscores in your variable names and everywhere else in the code base uses camel case, right? You're just going to have to roll with it. Hopefully your linters will pick this up, but if they haven't, don't be afraid of making the changes that they've asked for. Maybe you didn't put any tests in for the thing you added, and for some maintainers that's a no-no. So definitely make sure you've done everything you can to put the test coverage in place. And if you are likely to throw exceptions, are you throwing them in a way that's consistent with the rest of the project? And even if there are issues in your code, at least that way that it's going to bubble up in a way that's consistent with the rest of the code base around you. Bottom line is, do what you can to reduce the amount of spaghetti code in the code base rather than increase it. We talked a little bit about the one diff, one thesis principle, to make sure that your diffs are adding very, very incrementally and cleanly to the code base. But definitely make sure you're making the code base cleaner rather than less clean. And when we talk about spaghetti code, where there's little bits over here and little bits over there, and they all kind of interrelate in ways people don't understand, if a reviewer sees you writing code that's doing that, you're going to get a pushback on that. Time for you to reassess the approach you've taken, breaking it down into smaller pieces. Think about how to do, maybe even fewer diffs or more diffs with fewer theses in each, so that you can really modularize things and clean up that risk of spaghetti. We talked a little bit about testing, but I really want to emphasize the value of testing in an open source environment. Most major projects will have tests. The smaller ones that don't have tests probably should have, or they will have. Make sure you can isolate your change with tests. Use them to your advantage. It's not a tax. Might seem like it's an effort to write a test to cover what you've worked on, but actually can often be an advantage. There's something called TDD, test-driven development, which takes this to the extreme. You actually write the test first, and then you write the feature or the bug fix in order to make the test pass. But there are less strict ways of doing that. But in any case, I think it's always valuable to ship a test alongside a commit or alongside a pull request. It makes you feel confident, if nothing else, right? It puts weight behind your conviction, especially if it's the first time you've contributed to a project. But it also demonstrates to a user or to the reviewer how your code works. The maintainer who sees this pull request popping up out of nowhere might be like, so what? What is this thing doing? It's often easiest to look at a test suite or a particular test to see, okay, this is for when you pass a string and you should have passed a number. I get it, right? And the tests are often a much easier way to understand what it was you were doing with your diff. So it's a communication mechanism as much as it is a way of checking the safety of the code base. Again, a point that I've probably made many times throughout this course, but I'm going to emphasize one final time. Please be gracious. You are working in a code base that is not at first yours, and you need to be a guest that is polite, friendly, cleans up after themselves, and behaves in a way that is befitting of the reputation you want to build. So if nothing else, remember that you're that guest. Remember you're contributing to someone else's repo. They'll give you feedback. Don't take it as criticism. Take it as a gift. They're teaching you. They're helping to educate you. They're helping to make you a better engineer inside and possibly even outside of this repo. And there are many ways to write good software. So you may have experienced certain environments and you thought you got pretty good at it, and now you're working in a new environment and you've got to get good at that all over again. Remember, you are not here to try to change other people's approaches or change their opinions or change the styles and conventions. You are here as a guest. You might not understand what it is they're trying to do. You might not even understand why. But if you want to make a contribution, you've really got to be like water and understand it. You're not going to learn anything. You're not going to add any value if you are the, quote, stick in the mud, and you're going to be the stubborn, arrogant contributor that wants to get things your own way. You need to adapt to the friendly environment that you have joined, and the rewards will be, commensurate with how gracious you are about that process. One final thing I should say is that things don't stop once you've made a contribution to the codebase. Of course, you can make further contributions to the codebase, but if you're proud of your work and what you've added you think is worth talking about, then do so. Keep an eye on the README for the project. Maybe there's a forthcoming release that will have your change in it. Many well-run projects will actually produce a README with every release listing out all the contributors. Well, you're going to be mentioned. That's super awesome. Make the most of that, and perhaps on social media or perhaps some kind of other forum, don't be afraid to talk about how proud you are to have worked on this project. It was just a small change, but super excited to have worked on X or Y or Z. And I think there's nothing wrong with talking about your work. It helps build your reputation. You're helping to bring attention to the project as a whole. And that'll boost your self-confidence for going back in and making other changes in the future. You don't want to be boastful, but I think there's nothing wrong with letting people know that you've been part of this bigger ecosystem. Okay, so we're coming to the end of this journey for now. Anyway, we're going to finish off with a quick conclusion of, I hope, many of the main lessons that we've picked up during this course, and use this as a jumping off point to talk more about this course and some of the topics we've covered in the forums. Again, I mentioned this a few times, but I do want to just bring this back as an aside at the end. This wasn't a comprehensive course about everything in open source. We talked a lot about making contributions to existing repositories, maybe some that have gained some traction, maybe some that are run by companies, thinking about how they might help you to grow your professional career. But that's just part of the overall open source story. We haven't talked about creating your own repos. Again, it's a high risk strategy, but it can bring its own rewards. That's something that I think is a real challenge. Would love to maybe talk about this in the future, on future courses or on the forums. It's a marketing challenge as much as it is a technical challenge. You need to understand what it means to start a new project, get its name known, get people to use it, then tell them why it's valuable, and then in turn bring on more contributors to help you. So it's a whole other story, which, if you're feeling brave, I'm not saying don't do it. Go give it a good shot. But that's not something we covered. And if you want to talk about that, I'd love to see you in the forums and have some conversations about that. One of the other things I want to summarize from our whole course here is that open source takes time. It is not a quick fix for your professional career. It's not going to be a way that you can get a job in big tech instantly. It's something that's organic. It's sometimes a bit of a slow burner. Popular repos are big. They take a long time to learn. It takes time to earn trust in those communities. You need to be patient. This is just the start of a longer journey. It'll take you probably months, certainly weeks, before you're a strong contributor to a given repo. And then it's only then you're really going to start being able to build those connections, build that reputation in the ecosystem. But a lot of this is just like joining a new team. When you join a new company, it takes 6 to 8 weeks to just get familiar with what's going on. So, you know, patience, I'm afraid, is a virtue when it comes to getting familiar with new software environments, new coding ecosystems. And don't get discouraged as that happens. You'll have highs, you'll have lows, but start with small, tractable problems. Expect that you'll get some rejections. Push on through. It's all part of the process. Every piece of feedback you get is making you stronger. And again, stress this over and over throughout this course. The social side of this process is critical. Open source is not a solo sport. It's about teamwork. It's about you building a reputation. It's about the people that you're working with. It's certainly not all about the code. If you're planning to use open source contributions to get a job, that by definition means you're going to be working with other people. And so this is a great place for you to demonstrate that you've got those skills, that you're growing those skills, and that your interactions with other members of the community and the maintainers are healthy. So demonstrating that is incredibly important.